Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We've been talking about action potentials. In this video, we are going to address the topic of refractory periods. Specifically, we're going to be looking at these two questions. What is the absolute refractory period and what is responsible for it? And second, what is the relative refractory period and what is responsible for it? So let's get started. So after a neuron fires an action potential, it enters what's called a refractory period, okay? The word refractory means stubborn, okay? So a refractory period is the period during which it is either impossible or very difficult to trigger another action potential, okay? We have got two parts of the refractory period that occur kind of during / after an action potential. Okay, so we've got the absolute refractory period, and that's the time during which a new action potential cannot be triggered under any conditions. Okay. Second, we've got the relative refractory period, which is the time during which it's harder to get an action potential. You would need a larger stimulus than normal in order to trigger an action potential, okay? So I will, of course, clarify all of this in the coming slides, but I want to kind of kick off the next slide by saying that refractory periods are due to the properties of those two channels that we've been talking about, the voltage-gated sodium channel and the voltage-gated potassium channel, okay? Right. Okay, so what you're looking at here, you've seen this before, I believe, or something similar to it, is a plot of the action potential shown in red. Okay, so we're looking at membrane potential over time, and overlaid on top of it are the permeabilities to sodium and potassium. Okay, so just to remind you, oh, sorry, also want to mention up here at the top is a little cartoon depiction of what is happening with the ion channels during the action potential. Okay, so just to remind you, at rest, right, we've got our sodium channels closed, we've got our potassium channels closed. I just want to remind you, these are the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. I also want to remind you that we have, not pictured here, we also have sodium and potassium leak channels that are open, okay? But if we are focusing on the voltage-gated channels, they are both closed when we are at rest, okay? We receive some kind of depolarizing stimulus from the outside, from another part of the neuron. That's going to bring that neuron to threshold. And what's happening at the channel level is that we are opening the activation gates on these voltage-gated sodium channels, okay? So far, this is review, right? That's going to cause sodium to come into the cell, and that's going to depolarize it, okay? But I want to remind you that depolarization ends at some point, okay, usually around positive 30 millivolts. And one of the main reasons for that is that our sodium channels close. We have inactivation gates on our sodium channels, those close, and that in part causes the causes the membrane potential to fall again. It causes the falling phase of the action potential, okay? So if we look at this part of the action potential, where we have our sodium inactivation gates closed, what is going to happen if we try to depolarize the membrane? So let's say we're trying to trigger another action potential. We try to do so by depolarizing the membrane. What's going to happen? So take a moment to think about that and answer that question. Okay, so hopefully you figured out that even if we don't depolarize the membrane to try to trigger another action potential, we're not going to get another action potential because the inactivation gates on the sodium channels are closed and we cannot get sodium flow through those sodium channels, right? So no matter how much you depolarize the membrane, you're not going to be able to open these channels. And therefore, you're not going to be able to get sodium coming into the cell the way you would need to in order to get an action potential to happen, okay? So that's what we call the absolute refractory period. That is why the absolute refractory period happens.